Good to see so many of you here. Happy New Year and welcome to our distinguished public lecture organized by RSIS. It's with great pleasure that I introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Sir Steve Smith, who is our latest S. Rajaratnam Professor of Strategic Studies, as has been mentioned. For information, the RSIS Raja Prof, as we call it, is selected from a global pool of outstanding scholars and eminent practitioners in the fields of strategic and security studies. It is actually a very select group, and it's not always easy for us to identify and get the right person. But today we are extremely fortunate to have with us such eminent person to be our Raja Prof. Sir Steve is currently the UK Government International Education Champion, the UK Special Representative to Saudi Arabia for Education, and a Fulbright Commissioner. I will share more details of his relevant background shortly. Sir Steve this afternoon will be speaking to us on a very topical question. Was globalization a phase in world politics or fundamental transformation of the international system? His lecture will examine the impact of globalization on the international system over the past 30 years and assess the counterforces that currently challenge the interstate networks that define globalization as a phenomenon. In our age of heightened geopolitical tensions and great power conflict, today's lecture is highly pertinent. Intensified great power rivalry and the intensified instances of military interventions and economic protectionism, as we have all seen, have led political and business community leaders to question if globalization still has any relevance today. Now, please allow me at this point to share a bit more on our speaker's accomplished background. It's not an exaggeration to say that Sir Steve possesses a wealth of experience across a long and distinguished career. He has held numerous strategic appointments in the UK's higher education sector, including, for instance, President of Universities UK from 2009 to 2011, board member of the Russell Group of Universities between 2012 and 2020, chair of Universities UK's International Policy Network, and chair of University UK's International Strategic Advisory Board, as well as chair of the UCAS board between 2013 and 2019. In terms of national policy impact, Sir Steve served from June 2007 until May 2010 on the British Prime Minister's National Council of Excellence in Education, which provided advice to UK government agencies about strategy and measures to achieve world-class education performance. Closer to home, from 2006 to 2024, Sir Steve was a member of the RSIS Board of Governors, on which he served with great distinction, as I, as current Dean, can attest. Since 2023, he has been a board member of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS. Sir Steve's significant academic expertise is also quite clear from his very extensive publication record. He has been author and editor of 17 books and over 100 journal articles, and has honorary degrees and fellowships from half a dozen universities in the UK, Hong Kong, and China. For his numerous signature services to academia and policy in the UK and elsewhere, Sir Steve was knighted in the 2011 Queen's Birthday Honours. In fact, I cannot think of too many other scholars who have had this much impact as Sir Steve, to be honest. I have no doubt that Sir Steve's distinguished public lecture today, in his capacity as the Raja Prof, on the topic of was globalization a phase in world politics or fundamental transformation of the international system, will give all of us much food for thought on how best to navigate the complexities of globalization. So with that, may I now invite Professor Sir Steve Smith to deliver his address, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kumar, for those very kind words. First of all, I need to make one position very clear. I'm speaking as an academic, not as a representative of the British government. This is the only speech I've given for a few years that hasn't been written by someone else. And one thing you learn working for government, as my friends the British Council will know only too well, is you can't ad-lib. Because if you ad-lib, are you making up a new policy? So this is me for or good or ill. And can I thank RSIS for appointing me to be the S. Rajaratnam Visiting Prof. It is a profoundly humbling honour. May I also say that although my academic career was spent in the field of international relations, the last 24 years have seen me move out of that specialism into running a leading university in the UK, the University of Exeter, and since retiring from there in 2020, taking up these roles for the UK government. I say that because this invitation to deliver the lecture gives me a really rare opportunity to look back at my career and re-engage with my academic discipline that hasn't been the case for a while. I should note that I continue to edit 3 major books for Oxford University Press, now in their 10th, 6th and 4th editions. Of these, the biggest by far in terms of sales has been a book called The Globalisation of World Politics, now in its 10th edition, and it's sold well over 1 million copies. Now, we've just completed the 10th edition, and it was the rewriting of that edition that gave me the idea for this lecture, because we actually have been discussing whether we can continue to call the book The Globalisation of World Politics, because so much has changed. So that's really the background for this lecture. What I want to focus on is the nature of globalisation, to ask whether it was a mere phase in world politics or was a more fundamental structural change in the nature of the international political system. It's genuinely worth asking this question, I think, precisely because when John Bayliss and I were planning the book back in the mid-90s, we thought we were moving into a new distinct phase of world politics. Globalization was changing the nature of international relations, was ushering in a new era. We definitely thought we were living through a transformation of international relations. So, I have to admit that I think I got some of this wrong. And that's one of the things I want to talk about today and talk about why. So in that sense, this lecture is an excellent opportunity to reflect on the limitations of our accounts of international relations and our tendencies to think that our era is distinct and novel. Until the late 80s, I tended to see power politics and notions of international system structure as the most powerful explanations of world politics. Thucydides, the Million Dialogue, seemed to me to be timeless. But something changed in the late 80s and into the 90s. It seemed to make some of those explanations questionable, if not obsolete. And that, in part, was the rise of globalization as a dominant feature of world politics. Let me say a little bit about globalization. Of course, massive debate about when globalization started, whether it was a Western phenomenon, but suffice to say that states, societies, and peoples have been interconnected for centuries. Many point to the old Silk Road as one of the earliest examples of globalization. More recently, many point to the late 19th century as a period where globalization really developed, peaking in the period immediately before the First World War, declining during protectionism and the Great Depression in the 30s, before growing in pace after 1945. But something in the 80s and 90s seemed to change, such that it was common to talk about globalization becoming a globally dominant feature of world politics. Societies around the world became affected more extensively and more deeply by events in other societies. Cohen and Nye define this difference between earlier phases of globalization and the world of the 90s in terms of an increasing thickening of interconnectedness. The point is that the increasing thickness of globalism, the density of networks of interdependence, is not just a difference in degree. Thickness means that different relationships of interdependence intersect more deeply at more points. Hence, the effects of events in one geographical area, in one dimension, can have profound effects in other geographical areas and on other dimensions. Globalization, then, involves a variety of different types of actors, not simply or even mainly nation states, interacting over a much wider set of dimensions and not just the historical military political one. Globalization is often measured by the value of total trade relative to GDP, or total economic output. By this measure, there's roughly 5 phases of globalization since the 1870s. But the peak of globalization on that measure seems to come just before the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2010. From 1960 to 2019, global trade as a percentage of global GDP increased from 25% to 60%. The stock of global foreign direct investment grew from 6% to 42%. Multinational corporations became the main carriers of globalization. These are globally organizing production and allocating resources according to the principle of profit maximization. And their global expansion reshaped macroeconomic mechanisms of the world economy. In 1996, there were more than 44,000 multinational corporations. They had 280,000 overseas subsidiaries and branch offices. In 1997, the volume of the trade of only the top 100 multinational corporations already came to 1/3 of the world's total. And that, between the parent companies and their subsidiaries, took another 1/3 of the world total. Multinational corporations then exerted enormous influence over the location and distribution of productive economic and technological power, not to mention where they declared their tax. Just one example, the revenue of the top 100 multinational companies, 11 trillion in 2021, exceeded the then combined GDPs of Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, according to the OECD in 2023. And according to UNCTAD in 2024, multinational companies account for over 6% of world GDP, 80% of world merchandise trade. They employ 82.3 million workers and are the primary sources of investment in manufacturing and services. Moreover, a nice little fact for the day, multinational companies transcend national economies. The largest American-based car exporter is BMW. Now, Ken Waltz summarized the core of the globalization thesis in 1999. It's a lovely quote. The most basic truth about globalization is this: no one's in charge. The herd has no telephone number. When the herd decides to withdraw capital, there's no one to complain for relief. Decisions of the herd are collective ones. They're not made, they happen. And they happen because many investors individually decide to make decisions at the same time on similar grounds to invest or withdraw their funds. Do what displeases the herd, and it will trample you into the ground. Globalization is shaped by markets, not states. At the same time, the world seems to be shrinking, and people are increasingly aware of this. The internet is one obvious but graphic example. It allows us to sit at home and have instant communication with people around the world. Email and social media, such as TikTok, Facebook, and X, have transformed communications and hence how we come to know about world politics. I read last week the second most searched for item on social media is actually cat videos, but I won't tell you about the first. But these are only the most obvious examples. Others would include pandemics such as COVID, pollution, climate change, global supply chains, and movements such as Black Lives Matter, Amnesty, Greenpeace, and global franchises such as Apple, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola. In our book on globalization, Tony McGrew says there are 5 features of globalization, just a word on each. The expanding reach of social, political, cultural activity, the intensification of connectivity across every sphere, the accelerating velocity of the circulation of ideas, the deepening engagement of the local and the global, and the emerging consciousness of global connectivity. Now, much of the literature traces the development of these trends and show that they've developed since the 60s, but there was something distinctive about what happened in the 1990s and 2000s. And I think it was the combination of these forces plus a series of significant changes in the world political structure that made many writers, such as myself, see the 90s as bringing in a new era. There are 5 political changes to mention, all very obvious, I think, to all of you. The first was that in the late 80s and early 90s, the major challenge to the old international political order was encapsulated by Francis Fukuyama's End of History, broadly defined as the notion that liberal democracy was the end point of human history. Writing as the Soviet Union collapsed, amid Western triumphalism about the winning of the Cold War, he wrote that it was not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. The end point, in other words, of humankind's ideological evolution was Western liberal democracy. Second feature in the 80s and 90s, there was a strong view in the literature that Russia and China were becoming less ideological and were becoming more pragmatic states, each moving towards a more democratic and embracing some, if not all, aspects of capitalism, or at least a market economy. It was not just that the West had won the Cold War, but also that other forms of political system were transforming into more normal actors in world politics. Of course, there are enormous criticisms of these ideas, notably from Sam Huntington with his arguments about the Cold War being replaced by a clash of civilizations, and by scholars such as Benjamin Barber, who saw an emerging muck world struggling with traditional regimes which he called jihad versus muck world. But from my perspective, in the 90s, what we saw was a conveyor belt of history in which all societies would have moved, albeit at different speeds, towards liberal democracy and a market economy. And that links to the third political change, which was the democratic peace theory, whereby it was argued that liberal democracies don't go to war with each other because on the one hand they share values, and because it's also more difficult for democratic societies to carry their populations with them into war. This underpinned the push for democracy promotion found in the Clinton and Bush presidencies of the United States. And it goes back to something Cohen and Nye had written about in Complex Interdependence, where they said that military force was in decline as a tool of statecraft. So taken together, these 3 arguments underpinned a fourth, which was that the international system was maturing into a rules-based international order. Its origins had been in the post-45 period, when organizations such as the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF constructed procedures and norms that, it was claimed, would produce a more peaceful and predictable international political system. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s and the absorption of many of its allies into organizations and treaties that had previously eschewed joining that order, I think what you get was a development of what could be seen as a morphing into an international order based on rules. NATO expanded, the WTO was formed, the promotion of human rights became a focus of ethical foreign policies. This Western doctrine, known often as the Washington Consensus, promoted by organizations such as the IMF, the World Bank, and global companies and political elites, therefore is seen as ushering in a different, wider phase of the order structure and the rules system of international politics. But it's the 5th one that I think did most of the explanation. Summed up best in Charles Krauthammer's 1990 paper on the unipolar moment. And he wrote, it's been assumed that the old bipolar world would beget a multipolar world. The immediate post-Cold War world, however, is not multipolar. It's unipolar. The center of world power is an unchallenged superpower, the United States, supported by its Western allies. American preeminence is based on the fact that it's the only country with the military, diplomatic, political, and economic assets to be a decisive player in any conflict in whatever part of the world it chooses to involve itself. Have these developments, the 5 political developments, the growth of globalization, really changed the nature of world politics? The debate is not simply that the world has changed, but the question is whether the changes are qualitative and not merely quantitative. Has a new world political system emerged as a result? There's been 3 responses to that debate, summarizing very briefly. The first, hyperglobalizers, who say, yep, it's an optimistic view, the world's changing, we're moving towards globalization, national borders are going to become increasingly irrelevant. Markets are the driving force. They believe, hyperglobalizers believe, liberal capitalism has created such strong economic networks that nation states are losing their grip on economic control. The second argument are the skeptics. They argue that globalization isn't really transformative at all. In fact, it's been greatly exaggerated. They actually say that what we call globalization is a more limited phenomenon. Much of what we consider global economic activity is in fact limited to interactions between the developed economies. The final perspective of the 3 is transformationalism. Here, theorists like David Held, Anthony Giddens argued that globalization is neither the death of the state nor an overblown phenomenon, but rather a transformative process that's reshaping how societies interact. Transformationalists see globalization as creating new forms of social relations and interactions. Now, briefly, I just want to sum up the main arguments for saying that globalization is a new phase, and then the arguments for saying that it is not. 5 main arguments in each case, very simply. Those who believe that globalization is a new phase in world politics, they say the following. First, the pace of economic transformation is so great that it's created a new world politics. States are less and less like closed units. They cannot control their own economies under global capitalism. The world economy is more interdependent than ever. Secondly, communications are fundamentally revolutionary. We live in a world where events in one place can be immediately observed on other sides of the world. Electric communications alter our notions of the social groups we live in. Thirdly, a risk culture is emerging, where people are realizing both that the main risks they face are global, pollution and climate control, and that individual states are unable to deal with these problems on their own. Time and space seem to be collapsing. Old ideas of geographical space and chronological time are undermined by modern communications and media. Fourth, more than ever before, there's a global culture that's emerging. Most urban areas resemble one another. Much of the urban world shares a common culture, a good deal of it emanating from Hollywood and Bollywood, and now Nollywood. Finally, a more cosmopolitan culture is developing, especially around issues such as climate change. People are beginning to think globally and act locally. However, just as there are powerful reasons for saying globalization is a new stage in world politics, there's also arguments against it. 5 again, and briefly they're these. First, globalization really is just a buzzword to denote the latest phase of global capitalism, namely neoliberalism. One effect of the globalization thesis is that it makes it appear as if national governments are powerless in the face of global finance, whereas in fact these trends can be reversed. One of the main planks of globalization, the global arena is something beyond our control, needs therefore to be questioned. Because if we keep saying that we've got to obey the world economy, got to obey the global market, that has enormous consequences for social spending, for social justice within societies. A second objection is that globalization is very uneven in its effects. At times, it sounds very much like a Western idea, applicable only to a part of the world. If 33% of the world's population is not connected to the internet, then we're in danger of overestimating both the extent and the depth of globalization. The forces, in other words, that are being globalized are conveniently those found in the Western world. For example, the discourse on human rights. What about non-Western experiences and values? Where do they fit into this emerging global world? The worry is, if they do not fit at all, what's being celebrated then in globalization is the triumph of the Western worldview at the expense of others. Third, there are major losers as the world becomes globalized. Globalization only represents the supposed and now obviously time-limited success of neoliberal capitalism in an economically divided world. The technologies accompanying globalization are technologies that benefit the richest economies in the world and allow their interests to override those of local communities. Fourth, not all globalized forces are good. Globalization makes it easier for drug cartels and terrorists to operate, for racist, xenophobic and misogynist groups to share views, whilst the internet's anarchy raises crucial questions of censorship and preventing access to certain kinds of material, including those trading in the sexual exploitation of children. And finally, what about global governance? The main worry here is about responsibility. To whom are the transnational social movements responsible? Are they democratically accountable? If IBM or Shell or Amazon become more and more powerful, this raises questions of accountability and democratic control. Most of the emerging actors, in other words, in globalization, are not accountable to democratic politics. This is very obviously the case with platforms such as X, Facebook, and TikTok, but it also applies to seemingly good global actors such as Greenpeace and Amnesty International. Indeed, Ken Waltz, again, the doyen of neo-realist thought, famously said, "Globalization is the fad of the 1990s, and globalization is made in America." Waltz argues that states, not multinational corporations or global markets, retain ultimate authority, as no other actors can match the capabilities, especially in security. For Waltz, globalization was a passing phenomenon, a cyclical historical process rather than a fundamental transformation. States weren't disappearing, they were adapting their functions to deal with global economic flows and challenges. So whilst acknowledging the role of the herd, that it had power, Waltz maintained that states ultimately set the rules and could influence these forces, emphasizing anarchy at the international level of governance. What do we think then, what's happened since the period of the high point of globalization in the 1990s and 2000s? What has that shown us? Well, some would of course point to the declining pace of globalization since the financial crash of the late 2000s. But of course, the single most significant development from my perspective has been the decline of the unipolar moment and its transformation into a multipolar international political system. Barry Posen said the unipolarity ended in 2011, but the best argument, I think, is John Mearsheimer's 2019 article, when he says that unipolarity ends around 2016 with the rise of China, along with a revival of Russian power, which has brought the unipolar era to a close. I found a lovely survey in Foreign Affairs in 2023 where they asked 80 writers on world politics, is the international system more unipolar than bipolar or multipolar? 44 of the writers said it was more multipolar, and only 16 thought it was still unipolar. So there's still a debate, but you can see the trend. So to sum up this part, and then we move to the final part of the lecture, I just want to look now at two arguments that have come along since the period of the high point of globalization. And these are the arguments of deglobalization and the argument of reglobalization, the two dominant themes in the literature since the 2008 financial crisis. What's certainly the case is that the sharp rise in economic globalization that took place from the 1990s onwards has slowed down, a phenomenon that's been neatly called globalization. According to the World Bank, foreign direct investment fell from $3.1 trillion in 2007 to about $1.5 trillion in 2024. The sum of exports and imports in trades and services rose from 27% in 1970 to 63% in 2022, but last year fell to 56%. The volume of world merchandise trade grew by an average of 7.5% before the 2008 crisis, but is only at around 3.5% since then. Some have argued that this slowdown in economic interdependence has been accompanied by diminishing support for greater interdependence, as witnessed by Brexit, the US elections of Donald Trump, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, rising populist parties in Europe and the United States, and so-called strong man leaders around the world. According to Ashby, there are four main features of deglobalization: the global populist backlash, resurgent great power rivalry, the expanding securitization of global connectivity, and intensifying global fragmentation. Populism has been built on festering public resentment towards mainstream politics, predating the global financial crisis of 2008, reinforced by growing public aversion to immigration, the social impact of widening inequalities, and divisive identity politics. Populism, mainly right-wing populism, has surfaced on all continents and led to such anti-globalization movements as the Brexit campaign in the UK and the Trump elections. On the second feature, I've already mentioned it, the resurgence of great power politics. Clearly, the three largest military powers, China, the US, and Russia, and you've then got half a dozen major economic powers. That's a very different world structure than we had during the high point of unipolarity. The third feature, and I think this is really significant, is that major economies have sought to protect the strategic sectors of their economies through protectionist policies. From reshoring overseas production, economic decoupling from China, through to vetting or even prohibiting foreign ownership and investment in key economic sectors. Examples of this are the restrictions placed by the US, India, Japan, and the EU on Huawei's role in 5G mobile networks, and the 2024 US government prohibition of Chinese ownership of TikTok. The fourth feature results from the previous three. Danny Quah refers to these as centrifugal forces, whereby the weaponization of global connectivity is driving a reconfiguration of global trade as geopolitics triumphs over commercial interests. And you can see a great example in this in the reaction by the main trading partners to Trump's 2025 Liberation Day tariffs, whereby they've sought to diversify their trade to limit vulnerability. The International Monetary Fund and the World Economic Forum both warned in 2024 of the serious risk of global economic fragmentation. So, taken together, these four features can be seen as deglobalizing forces. Danny Quah summed it up very nicely when he said, from 1980 to 2010 was a 30-year period where both geopolitics and economics drove world order to ever greater coalescence. I will call this, he said, centripetal. But from 2011 onwards, both geopolitics and economics drove world order to even greater fragmentation. I will, he said, call this the centrifugal era. By contrast, other writers see the period since the global financial crash as one of reglobalization. The difference between this and deglobalization is that whereas deglobalization sees globalization in decline, reglobalization sees it as being reconfigured. As Manfred Steger has commented, unlike the proponents of the deglobalization model, reglobalization thinkers reject the proposition that the dynamics simply follow each other like a pendulum. Reglobalization has three simple features. Global connectivity is becoming increasingly digital. Digital technologies and digital capitalism are increasing, whereas conventional modes such as goods trades are actually exhibiting limited growth. Secondly, whereas globalization was mainly a phenomenon led by the West, especially the US, now many countries are increasingly driving globalization. India, China, the EU, South Korea, Mexico, Saudi Arabia. It's interesting, isn't it, that of the 500 largest companies at the moment, China has 128, whereas the US has 139. So there's other sources other than the US driving globalization. Finally, reglobalization has a different ideological nature than globalization or deglobalization. It's far more aligned to government protectionism and interventionism. Thus, in contrast to market globalization, reglobalization involves policies that promote and protect what governments see as strategic sectors, debates over AI, computer chip production, electric vehicles. In my view, reglobalization is a much better description of where globalization is at today. The WTO neatly summed up the situation in December 25. Rather than collapsing, global trade is entering a new phase of reglobalization, shaped by shifting centers of gravity and driven by technology. So, in one important sense, the optimism of myself and many other writers in the 90s about this transformational effect of globalization were not entirely wrong. What we got wrong was the notion that a specific form of globalization, neoliberal globalization, based on a very Western view of the world, would slowly but surely apply across the world. Looking back, with a mixture of humility and embarrassment, my confidence in that view reflects, of course, my location, writing in the UK, taking one partial set of developments to be universally applicable. At the very least, there was a real naivety in notions of the human rights discourse and the commitment to an ethical foreign policy, both of which drove much US and European foreign policy in the 90s and the 2000s. But that error does not mean that globalization is declining, only that it's changing its form. Most recently, the situation has shifted gear such that the world bears little resemblance to the world the globalists thought was a once-and-for-all change in the 90s. This is the renewal of what might be called great power rivalry, to an extent that has frankly surprised, shocked, and depressed me. It, of course, is typified by the foreign policy of Donald Trump in his second term, but also by a series of other strong men leaders around the world. Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi, Recep Erdogan, Viktor Orban, Jair Bolsonaro, Benjamin Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman. A particularly stark reminder of this came on the day of his inauguration in January 2025, when President Donald Trump issued a presidential memorandum, America First Trade Policy, initiating a radical shift in US trade policy. Shortly afterwards, the US unilaterally imposed a series of selective reciprocal, in quotation marks, tariffs on all its major trading partners. It withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords, the World Health Organization, dismantled the US Agency for International Development, and instituted a review of US memberships of all international bodies. As I wrote this lecture, in the second week of January, the news headlines were full of Iran, Greenland, Venezuela, Mexico, Ukraine, tariffs. Not only have we seen a significant shift towards multipolarity, but more significantly, the world seems to have moved away from that optimistic view of a more rules-based international system. We now have the Monroe Doctrine applying to the Western Hemisphere, and genuine fears about a world of contained spheres of great power, influence, and control. Together, they've ushered in a world that in April 2025, Yuval Noah Harari termed rival fortresses. For Harari, supporters of the liberal order see the world as a potential win-win network of cooperation. They believe that conflict is not inevitable because conflict can be mutually beneficial. But by contrast, Harari argues that in the Trumpian world, the world is a zero-sum game, in which every transaction involves winners and losers. In Trump's world, international agreements, organizations, and laws cannot be anything but a plot to weaken some countries and strengthen others. For Harari, he says Trump's view is of a mosaic of fortresses where countries are separated by high financial, military, cultural, and physical walls. In the absence of universal values, global institutions, and international laws, how would rival fortresses resolve their disputes? Trump's solution is simple. The way to prevent conflicts is for the weak to do whatever the strong demand. According to this view, conflict occurs only when the weak refuse to accept reality. War, Harari says, is therefore always the fault of the weak. Thus, Trump blames Ukraine for the war with Russia because they did not accept who had more power. According to the Trumpian worldview, considerations of justice and morality are irrelevant. The only thing that matters is power. The same logic underlines Trump's plan for annexing Greenland. Indeed, just as I was finishing the lecture, we had the quote of his Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, when he said the formal position of the US government is that Greenland should be part of the US. Asked repeatedly in an interview with CNN whether the US would rule out using force, Miller responded, "No one's going to fight the US over the future of Greenland." Subsequent events after Harari's writing, I think, has proven him right. Just very briefly to end, anyone who's read the US National Security Strategy published at the end of November 2025 will have noticed the extraordinary shift that this document represents in US foreign policy. The document starts by saying that the strategy is motivated above all by what works for America, or, to put it in its own words, 2 words, America first. It says, quote, "The outsized influence of large, rich, and stronger nations is a timeless truth of world politics. The United States must be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere as a condition of our security and prosperity, a condition that allows us to assert ourselves confidently where and when we need to in the region. China appears as the major adversary of the US. The Trump administration, it says, will reverse the mistaken policy of previous American administrations to try and, but then fail, to get China to join the rules-based international order. For those of us that live in Europe, the strategy says Europe faces the stark prospect, its words, of civilizational erasure. Should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years. And again, a quote, "As such, it's far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and military strong enough to remain reliable allies. As for Russia, unlike all previous US national strategy statements since 2001, it's not mentioned as an adversary. The national security strategy treats Russia as a challenge that can be moderated, principally through diplomatic engagement, allowing the US to deal with other priorities, notably China. The NSS sees a Russia that can be normalized." More recently, in an interview with the New York Times, President Trump declared that his power as commander-in-chief is constrained only by his own morality, brushing aside international law. Asked if there were any limits on his global powers, Mr. Trump said, "Yeah, there is one thing, my own morality." We can all rest peacefully there. "My own mind, it's the only thing that can stop me. I don't need international law," he said. Let me conclude then with 4 points. First, I was wrong about globalization being a transformative movement in world politics, transcending power politics and moving the world to a more rules-based international order. That makes me reflect that as scholars, we're always caught up in the circumstances in which we're writing. We take as permanent that which is temporary. We see as universal that which is partial. We write as if ours is a view from nowhere, where in fact there can be no view from nowhere in the social world. Second, I was not entirely wrong about globalization, in that it has not declined or gone into reverse. It's simply taken on new forms. We're in a re-globalized world, one in which globalization is being created by a much deeper and a much wider set of actors than in its previous manifestations. In that world, states remain dominant actors, but are both increasingly called on by their populations to control or manage the effects of globalization, and yet have less ability to deal with many of the effects of a reglobalized world. Third, what globalization has done is massively to increase global inequity. According to a report published in December 25, fewer than 60,000 people, 0.001% of the world's population, control 3 times as much wealth as the entire bottom half of humanity, with the richest 10% of the world's population owning 75% of wealth and the bottom half just 2%. I just want to say I wonder what the long-term consequences of that might be. Finally, I want to end on what is for me a profoundly worrying note, which is that we do seem to be moving into a world of rival fortresses. And the trouble with rival fortresses, of course, is the old security dilemma. How do you make sure you have enough military force to deter other rival fortresses without causing alarm for their leaders? Or, as Thucydides puts it, what made war inevitable was the rise of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta. Whilst you can see a division of the world into spheres of influence being a theme of the national security strategy in the US, what does this imply for those caught in contested zones of influence? What does this mean for allies? I wrote those words as many in Europe are asking if NATO can survive. But I'm going to end, if you will allow me, with a poem. I've been reading it a lot recently, written in 1919 after the First World War. It's by W.B. Yeats. It's The Second Coming. Some of you will know it well. It sums up his worries about the emergence of another cycle in history. His word for cycle is Gaia. And he wonders what's coming. And it's this. It'll take me about a minute. Turning and turning in the widening Gaia, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loose, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, whilst the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image after Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. I hope for our sakes that the forces of reglobalization can prevent this nightmare. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sir Steve, for that very comprehensive, broad sweep overview of globalization down the decades. Very sobering, and much to think about. There's a lot to really mull over and digest, but one of the things which perhaps the colleagues here mull over your comments and your assessments and think about what they would like to ask or make a comment about. I'll start off with essentially the points you made towards the end, that when you shared with us that when you started on the writing about globalization back when you worked with John Bayliss, right? There was this sense that globalization ought to lead to a strengthening of the rules-based international order that was set up after World War II. However, that has not turned out to be the case. He made a very relevant point that scholars tend to get caught up in the circumstances of the moment, but actually circumstances can change. A very important point you made was rather than agreeing with the comment made by some analysts that we are in a phase of deglobalization, rather we are in a phase of re-globalization, but it's just that a re-globalization where we see shifting centers of gravity forming, driven by technology. So essentially, globalization is not declining, it's merely changing its form. And within this form, what we can see, one thing is, important characteristic is, globalization has led to a tremendous increase in global inequality. But importantly, I mean, from a geopolitical perspective, which I think is of great interest to our colleagues here, you agree with Noel Yuval Harari's assessment that we are seeing the rise of rival fortresses, which sounds like contending spheres of influence, which I agree with you tends to be the impression one gets by reading the latest US NSS, National Security Strategy, with the Trump administration's clear focus on the Western Hemisphere. So maybe I can just ask you to just get the ball rolling on this. Do you see that what we should look for, what we should prepare for, international community, all of us, is how to live in a world of contending spheres of influence? I mean, would you say that a sphere of influence concept is something very relevant at this stage in time?
Thank you, Kumar, and thank you for a very clear summary of the main points of what I was trying to get over. I mean, two comments. One, yes, I agree exactly with the question as you've just put it. I fear, which is why I ended with the poem, that we are moving into a world of spheres of influence. We've seen it before in history, and what worries me is the old, what made war inevitable point, you know, the security dilemma. What worries me in living in Europe is really significant. Europe has depended on the American guarantee for all this time, and Europe does not, I mean, there's an echo of it in the NSS. Europe does not have the wherewithal at the moment to move towards the kind of defense spending that would provide that security. NATO was formed 3 years before I was born, and the old adage was NATO was in existence to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. And if the Americans aren't in, what does that imply for the peace that in the part of the world I live in hasn't been a given for centuries? It's been a given because of that structure of Europe, the EU, NATO, etc. So the first point is, I think we are moving into the rival fortresses argument. Nothing, of course, is immutable. There will be change. There will be life after Trump. But you don't need to be paranoid to think that there is that notion that the Western Hemisphere, the Donroe doctrine, if you take the analogy of that, what does that imply for this part of the world? What does it imply for Russia and Ukraine and the former Soviet Union? So the first big point is, I do think that's the way the world is going, and that's what I think is slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. Not the second coming of Jesus, but something far more profoundly worrying. The other thing that surprises me, I suppose your comment puts its finger on it, is what I've just said. For someone writing, you know, and sharing the consensus, I was president of the International Studies Association at this time. You know, the dominant view in the discipline was that we were moving out of that. So seeing it return is really quite something about how our inquiry, our work as academics, is fundamentally affected by the location in which we're working, the time. That point I tried to make, that we take things as permanent when they're temporary, as universal when they're partial. And it's, in a sense, it's kind of slightly humbling to sit here and say it, because what I'm saying now, I would not have thought was possible 30 years ago. And yet, what's happened to globalization and power politics has shown the circularity, not the pendulum, but the circularity of international relations. So I think we're moving into that world, and that world has historically not been, as you know as well as anyone, a particularly stable model for world peace. And that's the kind of slightly depressing feature of it. And what you do if you're a high welfare spending economy in Europe, well, how do you move a population towards the kind of financial payments you've got to put into defense in order to remedy that? That's a real challenge.
Well, thanks a lot, Sir Steve. A lot to think about. I would like to open the floor to questions. Please, if you have any questions or comments, raise your hand and the mic will go to you. I see a question at the back. Can somebody pass him a mic?
There's a lady over there.
Yes, yep.
Thank you very much, Sir Steve. My name is Jan Park, and I teach international relations at RSIS. Thank you very much for the impassioned lecture. I especially like the fact that you quoted Kenneth Waltz's article about globalization in full, and I really appreciate that. I might have missed it, but I think you, and your lecture was very comprehensive, as Dean Kumar mentioned. But I would like to ask you a question about two very distinctive developments in the modern period, which are nuclear weapons and artificial intelligence. And how do you think these two technologies might impact globalization? Thank you.
Thanks. I'll take one more question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go on.
I think I saw another. Yeah, over there, please.
Hi, my name is Min. I'm a private sector security professional. I was wondering, I think in this period of transformation, it's really easy to kind of focus on the challenges and the things that we're afraid of in the future. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on any interesting opportunities or maybe even bright spots for states and similar actors moving forward.
So what are the opportunities for states?
Okay.
Take these two first.
I'll take those two first. So on nuclear weapons, let's start with that. If you take the logic, which you'll know more up to date than I, if you take the logic of system structure theory, nuclear weapons actually don't alter that equation. I mean, I was teaching nuclear strategy at a time when we thought nuclear weapons in and of themselves were stabilizing. You'll know those arguments very well. And of course they can be in a bipolar structure. Whether they can be in a multipolar structure where war is a way of dealing with those conflicts is really an enormously significant question. And to be candid with you rather than polite, I worry that in the world we're moving into, I can see them being used again in a way that throughout all the years I was teaching international security courses, I kind of remained slightly confident that they wouldn't be again, because you really had to be crazy to use them again. But if it's the danger of, you know this stuff, it's the danger of miscalculation. If you add nuclear weapons into Ukraine, Russia, what do we honestly think you get? Do you get restraint? That's so on nuclear weapons. I was always of the view that the non-proliferation system was a good system, but ultimately the bipolar structure reassured me that use would be so catastrophic that they wouldn't get used. Now I have the fear that they, we were brought up to believe they were the ultimate weapon. And that leads me to your second point, and that is artificial intelligence. I mean, I could talk for another lecture, and thankfully for you, I'm not going to. What worries me about artificial intelligence is just the potential for adding even more misinformation, insecurity to the picture. When you look at some of the AI stuff and what it's doing, how it can manipulate, just simply the manipulation of images. Even the most clear-cut image can be remanipulated. And it's now got to the stage, you may be very different to me, but I struggle to work out what's real and what's not in that world. And that makes me concerned about misperception, misunderstanding, and how that goes on. The bigger point, and I'm completely inadequate to answer it, but I am just stunned by the transformative effect of artificial intelligence in decision processes, in the analysis of everything, and that strikes me as not necessarily a stabilizing force in world politics. Because I think, I used to do a lot of work on the systems, the fail-safe systems. And you can see exactly how they'll now, I watched that film recently, House of Dynamite, it was a really interesting film about how you respond to a perception of an attack. Artificial intelligence and what it does just compounds those risks to me, and I'm worried. And also, and here's the big point, and I know you obviously, I'm sure you're thinking of this, who controls it? I mean, artificial intelligence is absolutely certainly not controlled by states. And that, the effect of that on a population that looks to governments for solutions, and yet governments cannot control that technology, I find that particularly worrying. On the opportunities point, there are enormous opportunities, I think, in the long run. I think the difficulty is, I was stunned by the work of colleagues here in Singapore, Joseph and Yun Fung, on what's happening to ASEAN countries and where they're sitting between China and the US. I think there are enormous roles for organizations such as ASEAN, enormous roles for collaboration and alliances between states in regions. But if I'm being completely candid, I worry that in a rival fortresses kind of world, if you're in the middle of those forces, it's very, very, who deals with your security in those worlds? So therefore, opportunities, yes. We know more in the sense, but back to the previous question about, on the one hand, we have more information, but that doesn't always mean we have more accurate information. But the bottom line for me is there are opportunities, but I fear that we're entering a period that is at least more dangerous. So maybe one of the effects of globalization, that rise of a global consciousness, as we've seen over climate, as you could see some opportunities there for civil societies. Why I'm pausing even as I'm answering it is there's a lot of good men and women in the States at the moment, very, very opposed to what's happening. But it's happening. That's my worry.
Yes. There's a question here, and
that's mine.
Hi, Professor Smith. Melly Anthony. I wonder if I could push you further into your this thing about rival fortresses, spheres of influence. And you just talk about promises. And there's a lot of talk in this region about the promise and the role that middle powers can do, if only to mitigate the worst impulses in certain of the great powers. And in line with that is actually, with all of the developments that we're talking about in the role of middle powers, even a collective middle power like ASEAN, for example, I wonder if you could also add in the importance of agency. Thank you.
And one more.
Thank you. Will James, Assistant Professor in Strategic Studies, RSIS. Thank you for a very interesting talk. Question on whether the phase that you're referring to is bound up with also the humanitarian era, the era of humanitarian intervention, whether they go together, whether or not this was only possible in this particular era of sort of unipolarity. My contention would be that the rise of great power politics again makes it impossible for states to intervene in the way they did in the 90s and noughties because of the fact that China and Russia would oppose this, whereas they were weaker in the past. But I'd be very interested in your perspective on that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Niall Bowie. I'm an editor with the Asia Times, here today in a personal capacity. I was just curious, do you have any thoughts on the recent speech that a Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, gave at Davos? A lot of people are talking about it, and he delivered sort of a reappraisal of the rules-based order, framed it in a way that I wouldn't think a major Western leader would. So any thoughts on that?
Gosh, there are three great questions there. I will do my best to and fail in answering them properly. On the first point, I mean, so middle powers clearly have agency, and in this part of the world actually is almost the quintessential case study, precisely because of the overarching structure of great power rivalry in the region. I think the complication is that agency is an extraordinarily difficult act to actually undertake. I look at the moment at our Prime Minister back in Britain going to China today. And on the one hand, he's being criticised for going. On the other hand, he's criticised for being, siding with Trump. How do you balance those two? So agency is my old mate Martin Hollis, who I wrote a book with, famously said, what was it? He said, economics is the study of how people make choices, and sociology is the study of why they have no choices to make. The trouble with agency is it sometimes implies things are possible that are not, and I think the difficulty for middle powers is not simply the balance, it's how you aggregate the balance between middle powers. So in the ASEAN region, I'm fascinated by, the potential is enormous, and that's the lived experience that's got to be done. But the difficulty is, as Ewan and Joe's work showed, the region itself is pulled in different ways. So aggregation is really problematic, and we see it all the time in Europe. So yes, intellectually, agency, the role of middle powers, the opportunities, goes back to an earlier question, are there, but it's an extraordinarily difficult act, especially in parts of the world where people are used to a lifestyle and a living standard that precludes the things that you need to do to make the agency come up with a defense policy and a military policy and posture that works. On humanitarian intervention, I agree with you completely. I had several colleagues who did a lot of work on humanitarian intervention, and I suppose there's two big points, aren't there? One, it was possible only because of the structure of world politics at that time, that it's very difficult to imagine it happening now. But secondly, it was the imposition of a certain set of views and a certain set of ideological positions. And several of my colleagues who I worked with got into really difficult times when they were pushing humanitarian intervention, which looked awfully like Western notions of rights and Western notions of what should be intervened on, and the myopia of the ones we intervened on and ones we didn't intervene on was also, I think, a significant point. So I think it's now much, much, much more difficult. On Mark Carney, I thought it was an absolutely brilliant speech, personally. I was surprised. I kind of agree with it completely. The question is, and this is, I mean, I don't know the answer to this. The question is, and it's like, you know, it's kind of 4 a.m. in the casino and you're going to put all your money on red, right? Do you go his route or do you try and balance it? I mean, and if you're not Carney in Canada, but you're a European leader or a leader in this part of the world, do you have the ability, do you have the maneuverability to be able to say that? Or to put it very simplistically, do you get a worse deal? And I think that raises some enormous questions about political responsibility. You know, and that, I think, is what reglobalization has made almost unbelievable. But and in fact, take all the questions we've just been asked. The answers would have been different 30 years ago. Because now, a politician, you know, I'm sorry to use an example back from Britain, forgive me, but when Starmer went to meet Trump and took out the letter from the King, you know, the reaction in Britain to a lot of that was, oh my God, what, you know, how can you do that? You know, that's kowtowing, to use the over, you know, that's, you know, and yet for a short while it worked. I mean, and I think the really fascinating question, and in your profession, it must be a question you ask all the time, what is the responsible act of a leader? And, you know, I like to, you know, I mean this very personal point, which is why I read the poem. I like to think, it's that line in Cabaret, the film, what would you do? You know, it's really easy to say, oh, I shouldn't do this. You've got agency, your opportunities, you should, you know, speak truth to power, straightforward. But if the consequences of that are on your population, or cynically, you're out of office, I think those challenges are much more difficult. The world was simpler during the high point of globalization. You know, you could stand up and talk about ethical foreign policy and not think whose ethics, because it was obvious, right? World was moving towards democratic peace. It was moving towards end of history. Can't do that now. So for all the reasons we've talked about in this discussion, I think the Carney speech was brilliant. I'd love to have made it. Do you know what I mean? But I'm just enormously conscious that politics is the art of the possible, and in my career, in my life, I've seen so many people grandstand. And politics is ultimately having to deal with the responsibility of doing what you think is the right thing for people. And I think that's, and I mean, I'm not knocking Carney, I'm saying I think it's even more difficult now than ever before.
Any other comments? There's one over there.
It's two.
Two, yeah. Bernard first.
Bernard.
The guy in front.
Thanks. If I were able to put you into a time machine and go back to the days where you were teaching nuclear strategy, knowing what you now know, would you still teach nuclear weapons as the absolute weapon?
Simple question.
Yeah.
Behind.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Jaskirat Gujral, a student of strategic studies from RSIS. My question was more on the lines of, do you believe that unipolarity enables globalization, and that now the reason it's struggling is because the world is going towards an increasingly multipolar world? And if in case that is the case, do we expect a different kind of globalization if, let's say, China becomes the hegemon, or if Russia again becomes the hegemon, something on those lines? Thank you, sir.
Okay. On both of those, Bernard, no, I wouldn't, is the truth. I think, being again self-critical, and I'll say something else as well. I think I mistook a technological phenomenon, whereas it in fact was an epiphenomenon of a political phenomenon, if you see. In other words, what made nuclear weapons look like the ultimate weapon was the structure of the system, right? Change the structure of the system, they're no longer the ultimate weapon. AI might be the ultimate weapon. Not a trivial point. If you imagine what a bad actor could do to ICU units in hospitals, electricity, sewerage. It's fascinating, Bernard, to reflect on the way in which, and this is realism, not the IR realism, but scientific realism. The things we observe are phenomena often caused by things we don't observe. And in that sense, I think nuclear weapons were seen as the ultimate weapon and actually were seen as kind of reassuring. But change, the structure, and they don't look like that. So I think I didn't see the conditions of my own thinking, is probably a better way of putting it. On the point about unipolarity, I think, if I've understood the question correctly, I think unipolarity was the structural accompaniment to globalization of a certain form. I think we are still globalizing, but as I tried to get to grips with, globalization is now as much engineered in companies in Bangalore as it is in Washington, and is as much engineered by non-state actors as state actors. And the task, back to the question about Carney, the task of leaders is to balance that. And I think the tragedy is at exactly the moment, exactly at the moment that electorates are demanding governments act. Their ability to act, especially in the AI world, is going to be much more difficult. If I was to link Bernard's point, I think AI is going to become extraordinarily significant in that world. And I think the multipolar structure we're now moving into will see a different form of globalization, and not necessarily one that has with it the liberal Western optimism that I think characterized much of the thinking of the main theories of globalization.
Any other comments or questions? Okay, we have one. This will be the final round of questions.
Thank you. Han Fuk Kwang from RSIS. I suppose one big factor which you have not spent as much time as I thought you would in addressing the big challenges to globalization and all the changes that has happened to it over the last 20 to 30 years. The elephant in the room, as it were, is China's big rise. Has been spectacular, not only in, and I think the big challenge is not only the size of the impact that it has made in terms of trade, in terms of investment, in terms of the challenges that it has posed to the Western world. The deindustrialization of large parts of the US as a result of cheap Chinese goods flooding in, and so on. But that it is also a very different political entity from the West. It's politics, it's culture, it's ideology, posing a very serious intellectual challenge, to liberal Western democracy, as it were. And you could, I suppose, explain all the changes that has taken place in the globalized world to China's big rise, the shock to the system, as it were. And that many of the problems we face is the inability, especially in the Western world, to accommodate China's rise. So I would like to your thoughts on this, whether that's been a central question in your work as well. Thank you.
And final question in front.
Thanks, Steve. Kane from the British Council. So I just wanted to get your perspective, really in Singapore, spending a little bit of time here, and your reflections on how Singapore has been able to kind of balance its relationship rather successfully between two diverse great powers. And in this new era, what role does a country like Singapore have to play where its very nature relies its survival on globalization? What role does Singapore have to play in that new era?
Thanks very much. Thank you for those two. So on China, undeniably you're right. China's rise is not the only, but one of the absolutely major structural changes. And I was trying to get to that. I mean, if you look at what ends unipolarity above everything else, the number one feature is the rise of China. What alters the industrial and trade picture between 1990 and now is China's impact on the world economy. Your key point, I think, or rather the key point that I take from your question, is that point about the intellectual challenge. And again, and I kind of wince as I answer, as I say these words. The view was, in the 90s, as you'll know, China would be normalized. China would enter the system and move towards a more rules-based order. And that phrase in the American NSS, that previous administrations have failed by thinking that they can bring China into the rules-based order. I think China is an incredibly different kind of society, although I'm pausing as I say that, because there are a lot of similarities in the kind of, if I can use the word authoritarian rule, which have a lot of similarities with stuff that's happening in the States. One of the features that worries me about the rival fortresses argument is that within the fortresses, everyone behaves the same. They're hegemons, regional hegemons. And so your central point is correct. It's China's rise that ends unipolarity. There's no question about that. It's China's economic role that alters fundamentally the nature of the world economy in the last 30 years. And it's the, what's the word? It's the naivety of the view that in becoming a great power, in becoming one of the dominant powers, that it would follow a set of rules, of a rules-based order, that I think was a major mistake of thinking at that time. But the literature was full of it. And it really was an assumption not just about power, but about the political transformation that was happening. I studied Chinese politics at university before the 1990s, I should add. And a lot of the argument was, would China become, quote, a normal power? And I think we now have the answer. But the paradox of your question is that in an odd way, the leading world powers are increasingly behaving like each other. And that's the fortress's argument that worries me. I think anyone in Europe reading the NSS and the view of what the American administration thinks about Europe, that's an existential shock to our view of that relationship. On Singapore, I mean, Singapore strikes me as being exquisitely successful at managing that relationship. I've been coming here I've been here about 80 times. And I every time I come and I talk, and I work with my friends and colleagues at RSIS and LKY School now, that absolute focus on the balancing. And you deftly put, there's 2 points. One, the balancing, and the second is Singapore relies on a globalized world economy for much of what it does. My personal view, I hold in, it's a very genuine personal view, I hold in enormous regard the ability of governments here over the years to do that balancing. It comes back to the earlier questions about what are the opportunities. You can do it, but if you moved Singapore a few thousand miles to the northeast, it would look a bit different. And so I think, you know, it's making the most, absolutely, as it always has, of its abilities. And it's a case study. But for me, the shock is that in other parts of the world, A, those options aren't available. B, there's not the focused leadership on that. And thirdly, I think the shock to the system of the world we're moving into, especially with Trump too, means it's going to take a long while for those leaders and those publics to adjust to that. I don't know the latest data, but if you did, you'll know this. If you did a lot of the look at a lot of the polling in Britain, you know, there's no support, or very little support, for engaging with the challenges. In Singapore, they've always engaged with those challenges, and they've done it incredibly successfully. The trouble is, ultimately, in the final analysis, system structure, I think, dominates agency on this. But Singapore is exemplary in what it does. But my goodness, it takes an enormous amount of work to do it. And I can add rather nicely at the end, that's why organizations such as RSIS are so important in having the debate in the public realm that enables publics to understand the choices that leaders make.
Well, thank you very much. We've come to the end of the session. Time is out, and Prof. Steve has other arrangements. But I mean, it has been said that we really do need to analyze the world as it is and not what we wish it should be, and very few people are able to help us do so, apart from Professor Sir Steve Smith. So please join me in thanking him for sharing his insights with us this afternoon.